Far from the great forests of the land of fire, beyond the plains where armies once marched, and beyond the borders where most shinobi history is usually told, there exists a nation surrounded almost entirely by the sea. A place where the air is heavy with moisture, where the horizon is often hidden behind rolling layers of pale fog, and where the sound of waves quietly replaces the rustle of leaves. This is the land of water, an island nation scattered across a wide archipelago, where the ocean is both barrier and protection. Within this distant land lies one of the most mysterious villages in the shinobi world, Kirigakure, the Hidden Mist Village. At first glance, Kirigakure appears almost peaceful. The village is built along waterways and surrounded by towering cliffs that rise out of the mist like quiet guardians. Narrow bridges connect districts across deep canals. Wooden structures and tall watchtowers disappear into drifting fog, giving the entire settlement a dreamlike atmosphere. From a distance, it can seem calm, almost tranquil, as if time moves more slowly there. But the mist that gives the village its name also hides its past, and that past is darker than most realize. To understand Kirigakure's history, one must first understand the environment that shaped it. The land of water is not a single continuous landmass like many of the other great nations. Instead, it is composed of scattered islands separated by cold seas and unpredictable currents. Travel between these islands has always been difficult, especially in earlier centuries when reliable navigation was rare and storms could appear without warning. This geography created a culture of isolation, while nations like the Land of Fire developed large inland trade routes and extensive diplomatic relationships. The Land of Water remained distant from much of the mainland shinobi world. Its people grew accustomed to self-reliance. Communities learned to survive without expecting help from neighboring lands. And over generations, this isolation began to shape their worldview. Strength became the most valued trait. Where resources were limited and connections to other nations were weak, survival depended on resilience, the ability to endure harsh conditions, to defend one's territory, and to eliminate threats quickly became central values. These ideals gradually evolved into the military philosophy that would define Kirigakure for centuries. But the story of the Hidden Mist does not truly begin until the era that reshaped the entire shinobi world, the Warring States period. During that time, the world was not organized into stable villages as it is later in history. Instead, powerful clans served as mercenary groups hired by feudal lords. Alliances were temporary, and conflict between clans was constant. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but war. The Land of Water was no exception. Several powerful clans fought for influence across its islands, each seeking dominance over the region's limited territory. Battles took place along coastlines, in mist-covered forests, and even across narrow sea passages where small naval forces clashed in brutal encounters. Among these clans were warriors who specialized in silent combat. In an environment where thick fog could appear at any moment, stealth became an invaluable skill. Shinobi learned to move quietly through low visibility, to track enemies through subtle disturbances in the mist, and to strike without warning. Over time, this style of warfare became synonymous with the region. When the great shinobi villages were eventually founded, following the example set by the alliance between Hashirama Senju and Madara Uchiha that created Konohagakure, leaders in the land of water recognized that unity would strengthen their position as well. Rival clans began to consolidate under a single banner, forming a centralized military power that could represent the entire nation. Thus, Kirigakure was born. The first Mizukage emerged as the leader responsible for uniting these clans. While history records fewer details about him compared to other founding figures like Hashirama Senju, his achievement was nonetheless monumental. Bringing together rival groups that had fought for generations required both strength and authority. And from the very beginning, Kirigakure carried a reputation for severity. Where some villages attempted to build systems emphasizing cooperation between clans, the Hidden Mist placed greater emphasis on discipline and control. Order was maintained through strength, and loyalty to the village was expected without hesitation. This philosophy was not initially seen as cruelty. To the people of the land of water, it simply reflected reality. The islands were unforgiving. Storms could isolate entire communities for weeks. Pirates and rogue shinobi often targeted coastal settlements. In such a world, hesitation could lead to disaster. Harsh training and uncompromising leadership were viewed as necessary safeguards against chaos. But over time, those practices began to intensify. The values that had once ensured survival slowly transformed into something more rigid, more unforgiving. The line between discipline and brutality began to blur. Young shinobi were pushed to prove their strength at increasingly early ages. Competition between trainees was encouraged, sometimes to dangerous extremes. The mist that surrounded the village became an unintended metaphor for its culture. From the outside, Kirigakure remained distant and mysterious. Other villages heard stories about its warriors, but rarely saw its inner workings. Trade with the mainland existed, but it was limited. Diplomacy occurred, but cautiously. Inside the village, however, a different reality was taking shape. Generations of shinobi were raised under the belief that weakness endangered everyone, that mercy could lead to vulnerability, that only the strongest individuals could protect the village's future. These ideas did not immediately produce the horrors that Kirigakure would later become known for. In its early years, the Hidden Mist functioned much like the other great villages, training shinobi, completing missions, and maintaining the balance of power between nations. But the seeds of something darker had already been planted. The isolation of the land of water allowed certain traditions to develop without outside influence. Leadership structures became increasingly centralized. Authority flowed downward from the Mizukage through strict chains of command. And as time passed, those structures began to harden. By the time the shinobi world entered its first era of global conflict between villages, Kirigakure had already begun cultivating a reputation for producing particularly ruthless warriors. Their training methods emphasized efficiency and lethal precision. Mist shinobi were taught to strike quickly and disappear before their enemies even understood what had happened. It was a style perfectly suited to the environment that birthed them. But such methods also carried consequences. Because when a society teaches its young warriors that compassion is a liability, when strength becomes the only acceptable virtue, when fear is used as motivation rather than trust, those ideas do not remain confined to the battlefield. They begin to shape the entire culture. And in the years ahead, that culture would transform Kirigakure into one of the most feared and controversial villages in the shinobi world. The mist that once protected the village from outsiders would soon begin to hide something else entirely. A system so brutal that even other shinobi villages would whisper about it. A system that would eventually earn Kirigakure a name spoken with equal parts fear and disbelief. The Bloody Mist. But that reputation, that terrifying chapter of its history, had not yet fully begun. For now, the village still stood quietly among its islands, shrouded in fog, watching the distant horizon where the rest of the shinobi world continued to change. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mist grew darker as the hidden mist village continued to grow in power and reputation. Another symbol of its identity began to emerge, something both feared and admired throughout the shinobi world. It was not a single individual, nor a specific battle, but a group of warriors whose legend would become inseparable from the village itself. They were known as the 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist. To outsiders, the idea of a group defined by weapons may have seemed unusual. Most shinobi relied primarily on their ninjutsu, their chakra control, or their clan techniques. Weapons were common tools, of course: kunai, shuriken, blades of varying sizes. But rarely did they become the defining symbol of a shinobi's power. Kirigakure was different. In the hidden mist, certain weapons were not merely tools of combat. They were heirlooms of destruction. Blades forged with unique abilities, passed down from wielder to wielder, each carrying its own history of battles and bloodshed. These swords were not simply given to soldiers. They were entrusted only to shinobi capable of wielding them effectively and surviving long enough to justify that trust. Over time, 7 such blades came to represent the elite military strength of the village. Each sword possessed a distinctive design and a unique ability. Some were enormous, capable of cleaving through entire squads. Others had more subtle properties, absorbing chakra, regenerating from damage, or altering the very nature of the battlefield. But regardless of their individual characteristics, the true power of the 7 ninja swordsmen did not come from the weapons alone. It came from the warriors who carried them. The swords were entrusted only to those who demonstrated exceptional skill and ruthlessness. To hold one of these blades was to stand among the most dangerous shinobi in the entire land of water. Their missions often involved assassination, infiltration, or overwhelming military force. When the 7 ninja swordsmen were deployed together, entire enemy battalions could vanish beneath the silent advance of the mist. Stories about them spread across the continent. Some described them as unstoppable warriors, capable of turning the tide of entire battles. Others told darker tales of villages attacked in the dead of night, of enemies who never even saw the strike that ended their lives. Like many legends, the truth likely lay somewhere in between. But what made the 7 ninja swordsmen particularly fascinating was that they were not a permanent group of individuals. They were a title. The swords themselves endured across generations, passed from one wielder to the next. When a swordsman fell in battle, another shinobi would eventually rise to claim the blade. This tradition meant that the group's composition constantly evolved. New warriors brought new personalities, new fighting styles, and new ambitions to the legacy of the swords. In this way, the 7 ninja swordsmen represented both continuity and change. The weapons remained constant symbols of Kirigakure's strength, but the people behind them reflected the shifting character of the village itself. Among these legendary blades, several would become particularly well known throughout shinobi history. One of the most infamous was Kubikiribocho, the massive executioner's blade capable of regenerating itself by absorbing the iron from the blood of those it killed. Its design was intimidating, broad, heavy, and built for devastating strikes that could end battles quickly. To face Kubikiribocho in combat was to confront raw, overwhelming force. Another blade, Samahada, possessed a far stranger ability. Rather than cutting like a traditional sword, it consumed chakra directly from opponents, weakening them while strengthening its wielder. Covered in rough scales rather than a sharp edge, Samahada almost appeared alive in the hands of its master. Other swords possessed their own deadly characteristics, explosive blades that detonated on impact, needle-like weapons capable of precise and lethal attacks, and massive twin blades designed to crush enemies through sheer weight. Each weapon was unique. Each had a story. And together, they formed the arsenal that defined Kirigakure's elite warriors. But weapons alone cannot create legend. For that, there must be individuals capable of embodying the reputation they inherit. One of the most famous examples of such a warrior was Zabuza Momochi. Though his story belongs more fully to later chapters of Kirigakure's history, Zabuza represents the kind of shinobi the village was capable of producing. Cold, disciplined, and extraordinarily skilled in silent killing techniques, he would eventually become one of the most feared members of the 7 ninja swordsmen. Yet Zabuza's life also illustrates something else. The swordsmen were not merely symbols of strength. They were also products of the environment that created them. Kirigakure's training system, already strict and demanding, began to evolve further as the legend of the swords grew. Young shinobi looked upon these warriors as the ultimate goal, the pinnacle of what it meant to serve the village. To wield one of the 7 blades was to achieve a status few could even imagine. And so, the competition intensified. Students pushed themselves harder during training. Rivalries became sharper. The expectation that only the strongest should survive began to seep deeper into the culture of the academy. At first, these developments were subtle. The instructors did not explicitly encourage cruelty. They did not yet demand that students prove their strength through violence against one another. But the philosophy of the village, its belief that weakness endangered everyone, slowly created an atmosphere where compassion became secondary to survival. The presence of the 7 ninja swordsmen reinforced that idea. These warriors were admired not for their kindness, but for their effectiveness. Their missions were often brutal, their victories decisive. And each time they returned from battle carrying their legendary blades, they served as living proof that Kirigakure's methods produced results. Other villages viewed them with a mixture of respect and caution. To encounter a member of the 7 ninja swordsmen on the battlefield was rarely a good sign. Their reputation alone could unsettle enemy units, much like the presence of particularly famous shinobi from other villages. In war, perception can be as powerful as any jutsu, and the mist understood how to cultivate fear as a strategic advantage. Yet the rise of the swordsmen also marked the beginning of something more troubling within the village. The admiration they inspired gradually shifted the cultural balance of Kirigakure. Strength became not just necessary, but celebrated above all else. Mercy became something rarely discussed. Efficiency in killing became the measure by which shinobi judged themselves. It is important to understand that this transformation did not happen overnight. It occurred slowly, across generations. The swordsmen did not create the brutality that Kirigakure would later become known for, but they symbolized it. Their existence reinforced the idea that the ultimate purpose of a shinobi was not merely to serve, but to dominate. And as this philosophy spread through the ranks of the village, it began influencing the next generation in ways that few could have predicted. Young students entering the academy looked toward the future and imagined themselves wielding one of the legendary blades. They dreamed of joining the 7 ninja swordsmen. They dreamed of proving their strength. And soon, the methods used to test that strength would become far darker than anyone outside the village could have imagined. Because the most infamous tradition in Kirigakure's history, the ritual that would earn the village its chilling nickname, was beginning to take shape. A tradition that would transform the training of young shinobi into something horrifying. A tradition that would ensure only the strongest survived. And in the quiet halls of the academy, beneath the drifting mist of the islands, the foundations of that system were already forming. By the time Kirigakure had fully established itself as one of the great shinobi villages, its reputation had already begun to spread far beyond the islands of the Land of Water. Stories circulated quietly among other nations, passed between traveling merchants, shinobi returning from missions, and diplomats who had visited the distant archipelago. At first, these stories focused on the strength of the village's warriors and the fearsome reputation of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist. But gradually, a different kind of story began to emerge. It was a story that made even experienced shinobi uneasy. A story about how the hidden mist trained its children. Every great ninja village maintains an academy. These institutions serve as the foundation for the next generation of shinobi. Young students learn the basics of chakra control, combat tactics, teamwork, and discipline. They practice throwing shuriken, memorizing hand seals, and understanding the responsibilities that come with becoming a ninja. In most villages, the academy is also a place where friendships are formed. Teams are built not only on skill, but on trust. Students grow together, learning that cooperation can be just as important as strength. But in Kirigakure, the academy gradually evolved into something very different. The philosophy of the village, its belief that weakness endangered everyone, began to shape the way young shinobi were tested. Training became harsher. Competition between students intensified. Instructors believed that only those who could endure extreme pressure deserved to graduate. At first, these tests were simply difficult. Students were pushed to physical and mental limits, expected to demonstrate resilience in the face of exhaustion and fear. They sparred more aggressively. They faced survival exercises in dangerous environments. The goal was to identify those who could function under the harsh realities of shinobi life. But over time, the expectations grew darker. Kirigakure's leadership came to believe that true strength could only be proven through life and death struggle. It was not enough for students to defeat opponents in controlled sparring matches. It was not enough to demonstrate skill with techniques or weapons. To graduate from the academy, a shinobi had to prove they could kill. And so, the most infamous tradition in the village's history was born. At the final stage of academy training, students were forced to face one another in combat to the death. 2 classmates, who may have trained together for years, were placed into a single arena. Only one would be allowed to leave as a full-fledged shinobi of the hidden mist. The other would not leave at all. This ritual became the ultimate graduation exam. To the leaders of Kirigakure, it seemed brutally logical. A shinobi who could not bring themselves to kill an enemy might hesitate in battle. That hesitation could endanger an entire squad. By forcing students to confront that reality before graduation, the village believed it was creating warriors capable of surviving the worst conditions imaginable. But the psychological cost of such a system was immense. Children were forced to view their classmates not as allies, but as obstacles. Friendships became dangerous attachments. Compassion became a weakness that could mean death. And so, the academy that should have fostered unity instead cultivated fear. Over time, this practice became widely known throughout the shinobi world. Other villages whispered about it with disbelief. Some assumed the stories were exaggerated, rumors distorted by distance and misunderstanding. But they were not rumors. They were truth. It was during this dark era that the hidden mist earned the name that would follow it for generations. The Bloody Mist. Few stories captured the brutality of this system more vividly than the early life of Zabuza Momochi. Zabuza was still only a child when he entered the academy of Kirigakure. Like many students, he trained under the strict expectations of the village's system. But from the beginning, there was something different about him. His talent in combat was exceptional. His instincts were sharp, and beneath his quiet demeanor lay a ruthless determination. According to legend, Zabuza had not even reached the final graduation stage when he demonstrated the terrifying potential that would later define him. During one of the academy's training periods, he entered the testing grounds where a class of graduating students had gathered. These students were preparing for their final exam, the deadly ritual that would force them to kill one another in order to earn their headbands. Zabuza watched them. Then he drew a weapon. And what happened next shocked even the hardened instructors of Kirigakure. Instead of waiting for the ritual to begin, Zabuza attacked the entire group himself. One by one, he slaughtered the students gathered in the arena. Dozens of academy trainees fell that day, cut down by a boy who had not yet officially graduated. By the time the massacre ended, the testing grounds were silent. The mist drifted quietly over the battlefield, and the village realized it had created something extraordinary and terrifying. Zabuza's actions spread through Kirigakure like wildfire. Some saw him as a monster. Others saw him as the ultimate embodiment of the village's ideals, a shinobi who eliminated weakness without hesitation. Eventually, he would go on to become one of the most feared members of the 7 ninja swordsmen, wielding the massive blade Kubikiri Bocho with deadly precision. But the deeper significance of Zabuza's story lies not in the violence itself. It lies in what made that violence possible. The academy system of Kirigakure had cultivated an environment where such brutality could occur. Children raised within it were taught to suppress empathy and focus only on survival. The graduation ritual was meant to produce strong warriors, but it also produced deep psychological scars. Entire generations of shinobi emerged from this system, shaped by trauma and distrust. And while the Bloody Mist continued to produce formidable fighters, its reputation grew darker with each passing year. Even among other hardened shinobi villages, the methods of Kirigakure began to seem excessive. But inside the hidden mist, few dared to question the system. The village had built its identity around strength. To challenge the methods that produced that strength was to challenge the foundation of Kirigakure itself. And so, the ritual continued. Students entered the academy, knowing that their classmates might one day become their final opponent. The mist drifted quietly over the islands, and somewhere within the village, another generation of children prepared for a test that no child should ever face. As the years passed, the reputation of Kirigakure continued to darken. What had once been whispers among other villages gradually hardened into something closer to certainty. The stories about the academy's brutal graduation ritual were no longer dismissed as exaggerations. Too many shinobi had encountered mist warriors on the battlefield, fighters who displayed an almost unnatural calm in the face of death. These shinobi fought without hesitation, without visible fear, and often without mercy. To the outside world, the hidden mist had become a place defined by ruthless efficiency. But inside the village, the situation was growing even more severe. The philosophy that strength must be proven through violence had begun spreading beyond the academy itself. The entire society was slowly reshaping around the belief that only the most hardened individuals could ensure the survival of the land of water. This period would later become known as the Age of the Bloody Mist. The term was not just a nickname anymore. It described the culture of the village itself. Fear became a tool of order. Suspicion became common even among fellow shinobi. Loyalty to the village was demanded above all else, and questioning authority was often treated as a sign of weakness. The leadership of Kirigakure played a major role in this transformation. By the time the fourth Mizukage rose to power, the village had already developed a reputation for severity. But under his rule, those tendencies intensified dramatically. The fourth Mizukage was Yagura Karatachi, a shinobi whose name would later become inseparable from this dark chapter of history. Yagura was not an ordinary leader. Even before becoming Mizukage, he was known for his formidable abilities. He possessed immense chakra reserves and extraordinary control over his power. In addition, he was the Jinchuriki of the Three Tails, one of the tailed beasts that had shaped the balance of power among the great nations. To many within the village, Yagura initially seemed like the perfect protector. Strong, disciplined, unyielding. But as his leadership continued, the atmosphere in Kirigakure became increasingly oppressive. The bloody mist system was not only maintained, it was reinforced. The academy's deadly graduation ritual continued. Shinobi suspected of disloyalty were punished harshly. Entire factions within the village grew fearful of speaking openly about their concerns. Even among elite warriors, such as the 7 ninja, Swordsmen of the Mist, tension began to rise. These were individuals accustomed to danger, but the growing climate of distrust within the village created fractures that could not easily be repaired. What had once been a disciplined society built around survival was gradually turning into something harsher, something colder. Shinobi were expected to obey without question, and the consequences for failure were severe. Missions became more brutal. The pressure placed on young recruits intensified, and the academy continued producing warriors who had learned from childhood that compassion could be fatal. Outside the land of water, other villages observed these developments with caution. The shinobi world had always been competitive, but there were limits most nations understood. Even during times of war, certain practices were considered too extreme. Kirigakure, however, seemed to be drifting further away from those shared boundaries. Its warriors were undeniably powerful, but they were also becoming increasingly feared. Inside the village, however, life continued in a strange balance between normalcy and tension. Markets still opened each morning along the canals. Fishermen still traveled between islands. Children still played in narrow streets between training sessions. Yet beneath that ordinary surface lingered a quiet anxiety. Families understood the expectations placed on their children. When a young student entered the academy, everyone knew what the final test would eventually demand. Some parents believed the system made their children stronger. Others feared the day when those same children might be forced to face one another as enemies. But in a society built around strength, openly criticizing the system carried risks, and so many remained silent. Meanwhile, the leadership of the village continued to enforce its rigid policies. The Bloody Mist era had become self-perpetuating. Each generation of shinobi trained under these brutal conditions grew into adults who believed the system was necessary. The cycle reinforced itself, tightening its grip on the culture of Kirigakure. The mist that surrounded the islands became more than weather. It became a symbol of the village's secrecy. From the outside, little information escaped the land of water. Diplomats rarely saw the inner workings of Kirigakure's training programs. Visitors were carefully controlled. The truth of the village's darker traditions remained hidden behind layers of distance and silence. But eventually, cracks began to appear. Not every shinobi accepted the Bloody Mist ideology without question. Some saw the damage it was causing. They recognized that fear could produce strong warriors, but it could also destroy trust, the very foundation of effective teamwork. Among these dissenters were individuals who would later attempt to challenge the leadership itself. One of them, as we will explore more deeply later, was Zabuza Momochi. Zabuza had grown up inside the brutal academy system. He understood its methods better than anyone. But even he would eventually come to see the flaws in the system that had shaped him. Others shared similar doubts. Some shinobi quietly fled the village, becoming missing none rather than continue serving under such oppressive conditions. Others remained inside Kirigakure, waiting for an opportunity to change its direction from within. But during the height of the Bloody Mist era, those voices remained small. The leadership was powerful. The system was entrenched. And the fog that surrounded the hidden mist continued to drift silently across the islands, concealing a village that had become one of the most feared in the shinobi world. Yet, what few people understood at the time was that the darkness spreading through Kirigakure was not entirely its own creation. There was another influence at work, a hidden force guiding events from the shadows. Someone who had discovered that a village already shaped by brutality could become the perfect tool for a much larger plan. And as the Bloody Mist era deepened, that unseen hand continued to tighten its control over the hidden mist. By the height of the Bloody Mist era, the atmosphere inside Kirigakure had grown colder than ever before. What had once begun as harsh discipline had gradually hardened into something far more oppressive. The Academy's deadly traditions continued without interruption. The village leadership ruled with absolute authority, and distrust quietly spread through the ranks of shinobi and civilians alike. To the people of the Land of Water, the source of this darkness seemed obvious. The fourth Mizukage, Yagura Karatachi. Yagura was widely regarded as one of the most powerful shinobi the village had ever produced. Even before becoming Mizukage, he had earned recognition for his exceptional abilities and calm, disciplined demeanor. His strength alone made him a natural candidate for leadership in a society that valued power above nearly everything else. But Yagura possessed something even more significant. He was the Jinchuriki of the three tails. Tailed beasts were rare and dangerous forces of nature, and the shinobi who carried them were often viewed with a mixture of respect and fear. To successfully control such power required immense chakra and mental fortitude. For Kirigakure, having a Mizukage who could wield that power was seen as both a symbol of strength and a powerful deterrent against enemy nations. At least, that was how it appeared on the surface. As Yagura's rule continued, the conditions inside Kirigakure only grew more severe. The Bloody Mist traditions were not merely maintained. They seemed to grow stronger with time. The Academy continued its brutal graduation ritual, forcing students to kill their classmates in order to prove their worth. Failure meant death. Survival meant becoming part of the system that demanded such sacrifices. Many shinobi accepted this reality without question. Others did not. Rumors of dissatisfaction began quietly spreading through parts of the village. Some warriors believed the leadership had pushed the philosophy of strength too far. They understood the necessity of harsh training, but the culture of fear that now surrounded the village felt different. It felt unnatural, but no one could easily challenge the authority of the Mizukage. And so, the system continued. What almost no one realized was that the true architect of this era was not Yagura at all. Hidden behind the actions of the Mizukage was another figure, one who had learned to manipulate events from the shadows with extraordinary patience. That figure was Obito Uchiha. By this point in history, Obito had already begun operating under the name Madara Uchiha, adopting the identity of the legendary Uchiha in order to advance his long-term ambitions. The real Madara had died years earlier, but Obito used his name as a mask, one that allowed him to move unseen through the political landscape of the shinobi world. Obito's ultimate objective was the infinite Tsukuyomi, a plan that required immense preparation and the manipulation of global events. To achieve this, he needed instability among the great nations. Conflict, mistrust, and suffering would weaken the shinobi world, making it easier for him to guide events toward the outcome he desired. Kirigakure, with its isolation and already harsh traditions, presented the perfect opportunity. At some point during the Bloody Mist era, Obito used the power of his Sharingan to place the fourth Mizukage under a powerful genjutsu. This technique allowed him to control Yagura's actions without revealing his own presence. To the outside world, the Mizukage continued ruling the village exactly as before. But the decisions guiding Kirigakure were no longer entirely his own. Through this manipulation, Obito quietly steered the village toward even greater brutality. Policies that encouraged fear and division remained in place. The deadly academy traditions were allowed to continue. The culture of strength at any cost became deeply embedded in the identity of the village. And because the orders appeared to come directly from the Mizukage himself, almost no one suspected outside influence. This hidden control created one of the most tragic chapters in Kirigakure's history. The people of the village believed their suffering was the result of their own leadership and traditions. Entire generations grew up thinking the Bloody Mist system was simply the natural way of life for shinobi of the Land of Water. In reality, their world was being shaped by someone who viewed the village as little more than a tool. Obito rarely appeared directly in Kirigakure. He did not need to. As long as the Mizukage remained under his genjutsu, the village would continue following the path he desired. From the shadows, he could influence policies, maintain instability, and ensure the hidden mist remained isolated from the rest of the shinobi world. Meanwhile, the consequences of this manipulation continued to grow. The culture of the village became increasingly fractured. Some shinobi remained fiercely loyal to the leadership, believing the harsh system was necessary to preserve Kirigakure's strength. Others began to question whether the brutality had gone too far. Even among elite warriors, doubts started to appear. Members of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the Mist were some of the most powerful fighters the village had ever produced. Yet even they could not ignore the growing tension inside Kirigakure. The Bloody Mist. Traditions produced strong warriors, but they also created distrust that weakened cooperation between shinobi. The seeds of rebellion were beginning to form. One of the figures who would eventually challenge the system was Zabuza Momochi. Having grown up within the brutal academy system himself, Zabuza understood both its strengths and its horrors. His experiences shaped him into a fearsome warrior, but they also planted doubts about the direction his village had taken. In time, those doubts would lead him to attempt something almost unthinkable, a coup against the Mizukage. But at this point in the story, that rebellion had not yet begun. The Bloody Mist era still gripped Kirigakure tightly, and the villagers remained largely unaware that their leader was being manipulated by an unseen force. The mist drifted silently across the canals and rooftops of the village. Shinobi continued their training. Students entered the academy, knowing the deadly test that awaited them. And somewhere beyond their sight, the man controlling their fate continued watching from the shadows, guiding the village, shaping its darkness, and preparing the shinobi world for a far greater tragedy yet to come. Even as the Bloody Mist era tightened its grip on Kirigakure, quiet resistance had already begun to form beneath the surface of the village. At first, these signs were small. A shinobi who suddenly disappeared from the ranks. A squad that questioned unusually harsh mission orders. Whispers among veteran warriors who remembered a time when the village had not been defined entirely by fear. For years, the oppressive rule of Yagura Karatachi had seemed unchallengeable. As Mizukage, and as the Jinchuriki of the Three Tails, his authority appeared absolute. Orders carried his name, and those orders were enforced without hesitation. But over time, the cracks in the system began to widen. Some shinobi had lived long enough to witness how drastically the culture of the village had changed. Older warriors remembered when the academy had been strict, but not murderous. When students had trained together rather than being forced into death matches. The Bloody Mist traditions had transformed that environment completely. Now, young shinobi grew up believing that survival required viewing their classmates as potential enemies. Trust became rare. Cooperation became fragile. Even successful teams sometimes struggled to overcome the instincts that the academy had planted within them. For a time, the leadership believed these methods produced stronger warriors. But strength alone could not sustain a village. As mistrust spread, some shinobi began questioning whether the system was slowly destroying the unity Kirigakure needed to survive. Missions sometimes failed, not because of enemy strength, but because teammates lacked the trust required to fight effectively together. And in the shadows of the village, these concerns slowly began connecting people. Groups of shinobi who shared similar doubts started speaking quietly with one another. They did not openly challenge the Mizukage. Doing so would have been suicide. But the idea that change might be necessary began circulating among them. Meanwhile, the harsh conditions of the village continued producing another kind of response: escape. Some shinobi simply chose to leave. Rather than continue serving under a system they believed had become corrupted, they abandoned the hidden mist entirely, becoming missing nin. Life as a rogue shinobi was dangerous, often hunted by former comrades, but for some, it seemed preferable to remaining inside a village ruled by fear. Over time, this quiet exodus weakened Kirigakure in ways that were not immediately obvious. The Bloody Mist system was extremely effective at producing ruthless fighters, but it also drove away many talented individuals who might have contributed to the village in other ways. Strategists, specialists, and shinobi with more balanced philosophies sometimes vanished into the wider world. And the more they left, the more rigid the village's culture became. Yet not everyone who opposed the system chose to flee. Some decided that the only way to save Kirigakure was to change it from within. Among those individuals were powerful shinobi who had personally experienced the brutality of the academy. They understood the system's strengths, but they also understood its damage. One of the most famous among them was Zabuza Momochi. Zabuza had risen through the Bloody Mist Academy in the most violent way imaginable. As a child, he had slaughtered an entire class of students before the official graduation exam had even begun. That act alone had cemented his reputation as one of the most dangerous warriors of his generation. But despite his fearsome reputation, Zabuza was not blind to the flaws of the system that had created him. Like many shinobi of the Hidden Mist, he had grown up surrounded by constant competition and violence. Strength was praised above everything else. Weakness was eliminated. Those who survived the academy carried the scars of that experience with them for the rest of their lives. For some, those scars hardened into loyalty. For others, they created resentment. Zabuza eventually became one of the legendary 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist, wielding the massive blade Kubikiribocho with devastating effectiveness. As one of the village's elite warriors, he had first-hand experience with the inner workings of Kirigakure's military structure. And from that position, he began to see something troubling. The village was growing weaker. Not in raw strength, its shinobi remained terrifying opponents, but in unity. The culture of fear had eroded the bonds that normally held a shinobi village together. Distrust lingered even among allies. Loyalty often came from intimidation rather than genuine belief in the leadership. For a warrior like Zabuza, this realization was dangerous. Because once someone begins questioning the leadership of a village like Kirigakure, the next step can become inevitable. Rebellion. Quietly, carefully, Zabuza began gathering support among other dissatisfied shinobi. These were warriors who believed the Bloody Mist era had pushed the village too far into brutality. They did not necessarily reject the need for strength, but they believed the system had become corrupted. Their plan was simple in theory. Remove the Mizukage. If the leadership responsible for maintaining the Bloody Mist system could be overthrown, perhaps the village could return to a more balanced path. The Academy's deadly traditions might end. The climate of fear might ease. Kirigakure could begin rebuilding the unity it had lost. But there was one problem with this plan. The Mizukage they intended to overthrow was Yagura Karatachi, a Jinchuriki with immense power. Even without knowing that Yagura was secretly controlled by Obito Uchiha, the rebels understood the risk they were taking. Attempting a coup against the leader of the Hidden Mist meant facing one of the strongest shinobi in the world. Failure would mean death, but the rebels believed the risk was worth taking. Because by this point, many of them had come to the same conclusion. If nothing changed, Kirigakure would eventually destroy itself from within. And so, deep within the fog-covered streets of the Hidden Mist, plans began to form. Plans whispered in secret. Plans that would soon erupt into open conflict. Plans that would transform a quiet dissatisfaction into one of the most dramatic rebellions in the history of the village. And when that moment finally arrived, the Bloody Mist era would begin to face its greatest challenge. By the time dissatisfaction within Kirigakure had grown strong enough to spark open rebellion, the atmosphere inside the village had already become dangerously unstable. For years, the Bloody Mist system had shaped every aspect of life in the Land of Water. Children were raised under the constant pressure to prove their strength. Shinobi squads operated under a culture of suspicion. Loyalty to the village was demanded above all else. Yet the very system enforcing that loyalty had quietly eroded trust between its people. Many warriors had accepted this reality as unavoidable. Others had simply endured it. But a small group of shinobi had decided that the system itself had to end. At the center of that rebellion stood Zabuza Momochi. By this point in his life, Zabuza had already built a reputation as one of the most fearsome warriors in the Hidden Mist. His mastery of silent killing techniques, combined with the immense executioner's blade known as Kubikiribocho, made him a terrifying presence on the battlefield. As a member of the Seven Ninja, Swordsmen of the Mist, he stood among the most elite shinobi the village had ever produced. But Zabuza's rise through the ranks had also given him a clear view of Kirigakure's internal decay. He had seen firsthand how the Bloody Mist traditions shaped the younger generation. He had watched students enter the academy as hopeful children, only to emerge hardened and emotionally scarred by the deadly graduation ritual. He had witnessed how suspicion between shinobi weakened cooperation in the field. To Zabuza, the village had lost its balance. Strength had always been a central value of Kirigakure, but the system now worshipped strength to the exclusion of everything else. Compassion was treated as weakness. Loyalty was enforced through fear, rather than earned through trust. And so, Zabuza began gathering allies. These were not ordinary shinobi. Many of them were experienced fighters who had grown increasingly frustrated with the direction the village had taken. Some had lost friends to the academy's brutal rituals. Others believed the oppressive leadership had pushed the village too far toward cruelty. Quietly, they began forming a conspiracy. Their goal was bold and extraordinarily dangerous: overthrow the Mizukage. At the time, that position was held by Yagura Karatachi, a leader whose strength made him seem nearly untouchable. As the Jinchuriki of the Three Tails, Yagura possessed immense chakra and formidable combat abilities. Few shinobi in the world could hope to defeat him in direct battle. But the rebels believed the alternative was worse. If the bloody mist system continued unchanged, Kirigakure would remain trapped in a cycle of fear and brutality. The academy would keep forcing children to kill one another. The village would continue producing powerful warriors, but at the cost of its own stability. Something had to change. And so the conspirators prepared for a coup. Details of the plan were kept extremely secret. Even within the group, information was shared carefully to prevent exposure. If the leadership discovered the rebellion before it was ready, the conspirators would be executed immediately. The risk was enormous. Kirigakure's security was extremely strict during the Bloody Mist era. Surveillance within the village was constant, and loyalty to the Mizukage was heavily enforced. Any sign of dissent could lead to interrogation, or worse. Yet despite these dangers, the rebels continued moving forward. For many of them, this was not simply a political struggle. It was personal. They had lived their entire lives within a system that demanded brutality from childhood. They had fought wars, completed missions, and survived the academy's deadly trials. But the longer they served the village, the more they saw how deeply the Bloody Mist ideology had damaged their home. Kirigakure was feared across the shinobi world, but it was also quietly breaking itself apart. The conspirators hoped that removing the Mizukage would allow the village to rebuild under new leadership. Perhaps the academy could abandon its deadly ritual. Perhaps the culture of fear could finally begin to fade. But what they did not understand was that the true power behind the Bloody Mist era was not Yagura alone. Hidden far beyond the awareness of the rebels was Obito Uchiha, the man secretly controlling the Mizukage through genjutsu. To the conspirators, Yagura was simply a tyrannical leader. To Obito, Kirigakure was a useful tool. This meant that the rebellion faced a far greater obstacle than they realized. Even if they confronted the Mizukage directly, they would still be fighting someone whose actions were being guided by an outside force. But the rebels did not know this. All they knew was that their moment had arrived. At some point during the Bloody Mist era, Zabuza and his allies finally moved to carry out their coup. The exact details of the confrontation remain somewhat unclear, but the attempt quickly turned into a violent clash between the rebels and the forces loyal to the Mizukage. The result was disastrous. The coup failed. Despite their strength and determination, Zabuza's forces were unable to defeat Yagura or dismantle the power structure supporting him. The Mizukage remained in control, and the rebellion was crushed before it could achieve its goal. For the conspirators, the consequences were immediate. Many were killed during the fighting. Others were captured, and those who managed to escape became fugitives. Among the survivors was Zabuza Momochi himself. Forced to flee the village he had once served, he became a missing nin, an outlaw hunted by the very shinobi he had once fought beside. His dream of reforming Kirigakure had failed. The Bloody Mist system remained in place, and the village continued drifting deeper into darkness. Yet, despite the failure of Zabuza's rebellion, something important had changed. For the first time in years, open resistance against the Bloody Mist era had appeared. Even though the coup had been crushed, the idea that Kirigakure's leadership could be challenged had begun to spread. And in the years that followed, the hidden mist would slowly begin moving toward a transformation that few people could have imagined during the height of its brutality. Even though the rebellion led by Zabuza Momochi had failed, the shockwaves it created inside Kirigakure did not disappear as quickly as the leadership might have hoped. On the surface, the village appeared to return to its previous state. The authority of Yagura Karatachi remained intact, and the Bloody Mist system continued enforcing the same harsh traditions that had defined Kirigakure for years. The academy still trained its students with ruthless expectations, and the deadly graduation ritual, one of the most infamous practices in the shinobi world, remained a looming shadow over every child who entered its gates. Yet beneath this outward stability, something had begun to change. The coup had exposed a truth that could not easily be erased. Not everyone in the hidden mist supported the system anymore. For years, dissatisfaction with the Bloody Mist era had existed mostly in silence. Individual shinobi might privately question the academy's brutality or the oppressive atmosphere within the village, but few were willing to risk speaking openly. The consequences of dissent were simply too severe. But Zabuza's rebellion had demonstrated that opposition existed. And once people realize they are not alone in their doubts, those doubts often grow stronger. In the aftermath of the failed coup, the leadership of Kirigakure moved quickly to restore order. Security within the village increased dramatically. Shinobi suspected of sympathizing with the rebels were watched carefully, and interrogations became more common. The Mizukage's forces sought to identify anyone who might have supported the conspiracy. Some conspirators were captured, others were executed, and many disappeared entirely. Those who managed to escape the village were forced into the life of a missing nin. Among them was Zabuza Momochi himself, who fled Kirigakure and became one of the most feared rogue shinobi in the world. His story would eventually intersect with the events surrounding Naruto Uzumaki years later. But at this point in history, Zabuza was simply another fugitive, one of many who had abandoned the hidden mist rather than continue living under the bloody mist system. Yet while the rebellion had been crushed, it had also revealed weaknesses within the structure of the village. For the first time in many years, the authority of the Mizukage had been openly challenged. Even though the coup failed, it proved that Kirigakure's leadership was not completely immune to internal resistance. This realization quietly unsettled the village. Among ordinary shinobi, the event became a topic that lingered in hushed conversations. Some spoke of Zabuza as a traitor who had betrayed the village. Others viewed him differently, not as a hero, but as someone who had at least dared to confront a system that many privately believed had gone too far. The bloody mist ideology, once accepted almost universally, had begun to fracture. Meanwhile, the deeper truth behind the era remained hidden. Almost no one in Kirigakure understood that the true cause of their village's descent into brutality was not simply harsh tradition or extreme leadership. The actions of Yagura Karatachi were being influenced by a far more dangerous force. From the shadows, Obito Uchiha continued manipulating the Mizukage through powerful genjutsu. To the outside world, Yagura appeared to be ruling normally. Orders continued flowing through the chain of command, and the village operated as it always had. But the decisions guiding Kirigakure were still shaped by Obito's influence, and as long as that control remained in place, the Bloody Mist era could not truly end. Obito had chosen Kirigakure carefully. The village's isolation made it easier to manipulate without attracting attention from the other great nations. The land of water's geography, scattered islands surrounded by endless sea, meant that information rarely flowed freely beyond its borders. Even diplomats from other villages had only limited insight into what truly happened inside Kirigakure. This isolation allowed the Bloody Mist system to persist far longer than it might have elsewhere. But no system built entirely on fear can last forever. Over time, the effects of the village's brutal traditions began to weaken its internal stability. Shinobi trained in such an environment often struggled to trust one another completely. Teams functioned, but the bonds between comrades were frequently strained. And in the shinobi world, teamwork was essential. Even the most powerful ninja could not complete every mission alone. Successful operations required coordination, communication, and loyalty between squad members. Yet the Academy's deadly graduation ritual had trained students to view one another as rivals first and allies second. This created a subtle but dangerous weakness. Kirigakure's warriors were incredibly strong as individuals, but the unity of the village was slowly eroding. Some of the most experienced shinobi began recognizing this problem. They had fought in wars and completed missions across the shinobi world. They understood that strength alone did not guarantee victory. A village that could not trust itself would eventually face serious consequences. These concerns did not immediately lead to another rebellion. The memory of Zabuza's failed coup remained fresh, and few people were eager to repeat that disaster. But the seeds of change had already been planted. Quietly, gradually, the mindset of the village began shifting. Even the academy system itself started facing growing criticism among certain groups within Kirigakure. While the leadership still supported the deadly graduation ritual, more and more people began questioning whether forcing children to kill one another truly created the strongest shinobi, or simply scarred them for life. It would take time before these doubts led to real reform. Years, in fact. But the Bloody Mist era had reached a turning point. The rebellion had failed. The system still stood. Yet the illusion of unquestioned authority had been broken. And somewhere within the fog-covered streets and silent canals of the hidden mist, a new generation was beginning to imagine a different future for their village. A future where strength did not have to come from fear. A future where Kirigakure could exist without the shadow of the bloody mist. But before that transformation could truly begin, the hidden forces shaping the village would have to be confronted. And the truth behind the Mizukagi's control would eventually come to light. As time moved forward, the Bloody Mist era of Kirigakure continued to linger like a thick fog over the islands of the Land of Water. Even after the failed rebellion of Zabuza Momochi, the brutal system that had shaped the village for years remained firmly in place. From the outside, the hidden mist still appeared to be one of the most terrifying villages in the shinobi world. Stories about its academy circulated among other nations. Tales of students forced to kill their own classmates in order to graduate spread through military intelligence networks and traveling shinobi alike. Many outsiders viewed these traditions with disbelief, wondering how a village could willingly subject its children to such ruthless tests. But inside Kirigakure, those traditions had become a grim reality of everyday life. Children entering the academy understood what awaited them at the end of their training. Instructors rarely spoke about the graduation ritual openly, yet every student knew the truth. Survival meant proving strength in the most unforgiving way possible. The system had created a generation of warriors who were undeniably formidable. But it had also created a generation burdened with trauma. Many shinobi who survived the academy carried emotional scars that rarely healed. The experience of killing a classmate, someone they had trained beside for years, was not something easily forgotten. Some responded by becoming colder, embracing the philosophy that weakness must be eliminated. Others buried the memory deep within themselves, and a few quietly questioned whether such a system should ever have existed in the first place. Meanwhile, the rule of Yagura Karatachi continued without visible interruption. As the Mizukage and the Jinchuriki of the Three Tails, his authority remained absolute. Orders issued from the Mizukage's office shaped every aspect of the village's military structure. To most citizens, Yagura appeared calm and controlled, a leader who demanded strength because he believed the survival of the village required it. But in truth, the decisions guiding his rule were not entirely his own. Hidden just behind the scenes, Obito Uchiha continued exerting influence through powerful genjutsu. By controlling Yagura, Obito ensured that the harshest elements of the Bloody Mist era remained active. This manipulation served his broader ambitions. Obito's long-term plan required instability across the shinobi world. Conflict between nations, distrust among villages, and the suffering of countless individuals were all pieces of a much larger design. The more fractured the world became, the easier it would be for him to guide events toward the outcome he desired. Kirigakure was simply one piece on that board. Under his influence, the hidden mist remained trapped in its brutal cycle. The academy system continued producing warriors hardened by violence. Internal tensions persisted among various factions within the village, and the isolation of the land of water ensured that few outsiders could see what was truly happening. Yet even Obito's careful manipulation could not prevent gradual change from taking root. The failure of Zabuza's rebellion had not erased the doubts that had driven it. Instead, those doubts continued quietly spreading among certain groups within Kirigakure. Some shinobi began paying closer attention to the behavior of the Mizukage himself. There were moments when Yagura's decisions seemed strangely rigid, almost mechanical. Policies remained unchanged, even when circumstances suggested that reform might be beneficial. The Bloody Mist traditions continued long after their effectiveness had begun to decline. To most people, this simply appeared to be stubborn leadership. But a few observers began suspecting that something deeper might be wrong. These suspicions were difficult to prove. After all, the idea that the Mizukage himself could be under outside control seemed almost impossible. A leader strong enough to wield the power of a tailed beast was not someone easily manipulated. And yet, the unease remained. Meanwhile, the long-term consequences of the Bloody Mist system continued shaping the village's internal structure. Some of the most talented shinobi produced by the academy eventually chose to leave the village entirely, unwilling to serve a leadership they no longer trusted. This steady flow of missing nin gradually weakened Kirigakure in subtle ways. Although the village still possessed powerful warriors, the loss of experienced shinobi created gaps within its military structure. Teams sometimes struggled to maintain stability when skilled veterans disappeared without warning. Even members of the legendary 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist were not immune to the effects of this instability. Several swordsmen eventually abandoned the village over time, whether through death, exile, or personal choice. The once mighty group slowly fragmented. What had once been a symbol of Kirigakure's strength began to reflect the fractures within the village itself. Despite all of this, daily life continued. Fishermen still sailed across the misty waters surrounding the islands. Merchants still opened their stalls along the narrow canals that wound through the village. Children still walked the streets on their way to the academy, unaware of how deeply the system shaping their future had been corrupted. From a distance, Kirigakure still appeared like any other shinobi village. But beneath the quiet surface of the mist, the consequences of years of manipulation, fear, and violence were slowly building toward an inevitable turning point. The Bloody Mist era could not continue forever. Eventually, the truth behind the Mizukagi's control would be revealed. Eventually, the people of Kirigakure would learn that their suffering had not been caused solely by their own traditions. And when that truth finally came to light, the hidden mist would face one of the most important decisions in its history: whether to remain the village of blood and fear it had become, or begin the long and difficult path toward something better. As the years of the Bloody Mist era slowly passed, the tension within Kirigakure continued building beneath the quiet veil of fog that surrounded the village. From the outside, very little appeared to change. The leadership of Yagura Karatachi remained firmly in place, and the traditions that had earned the hidden mist its terrifying reputation continued shaping the lives of its people. But beneath that calm surface, the internal structure of the village was beginning to weaken in subtle and dangerous ways. For many years, the Bloody Mist ideology had been built around a simple belief: only the strongest shinobi deserved to survive. This philosophy had justified the Academy's brutal graduation ritual and the harsh treatment of anyone perceived as weak. It had also encouraged a culture where fear and intimidation were often used to maintain order. At first, this system appeared effective. The shinobi produced by Kirigakure were widely feared across the world. Their reputation for ruthless efficiency made them formidable opponents on the battlefield. Missions assigned to Mist Ninja were often completed with chilling precision, reinforcing the idea that the Bloody Mist system produced unmatched warriors. But strength, built entirely on brutality, carries a hidden cost. Over time, the system that demanded constant competition and violence began to erode the unity that a shinobi village depends upon. Trust between teammates became fragile. Cooperation sometimes felt forced rather than natural. Even experienced shinobi occasionally struggled to overcome the instinct to view others as rivals. This quiet erosion of trust was not always obvious. To outsiders, Kirigakure still appeared powerful, but inside the village, the effects were becoming harder to ignore. Some of the most experienced shinobi began noticing how frequently talented fighters disappeared from the ranks. The number of missing nin leaving the land of water had slowly increased over the years. Some of these departures were the result of rebellion, like the escape of Zabuza Momochi after his failed coup attempt. Others left quietly. They vanished without dramatic confrontations or open defiance, simply abandoning the village in search of a different life. Every time this happened, Kirigakure lost another skilled warrior. And over time, those losses began to accumulate. The once feared 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist provided one of the clearest examples of this decline. In earlier generations, the group had represented the absolute peak of the village's military power. Each swordsman wielded a legendary blade and possessed combat abilities that made them famous across the shinobi world. But during the Bloody Mist era, the group began to fracture. Some swordsmen died in battle. Others defected or disappeared. The unity that had once defined the group gradually faded, reflecting the deeper instability within the village itself. Even the leadership could not fully ignore these problems. Yet under the continued rule of Yagura Karatachi, little seemed to change. Policies remained rigid. The academy system continued operating as it always had. The brutal graduation ritual still loomed over every new class of students. To most people, this appeared to be stubborn leadership. But the truth remained hidden. The actions of the Mizukage were still being guided by the unseen influence of Obito Uchiha. Through powerful genjutsu, Obito maintained control over Yagura, ensuring that the Bloody Mist era persisted exactly as he intended. For Obito, the suffering within Kirigakure was not a tragedy to be solved. It was a useful tool. A fractured village created instability. Instability weakened the balance of power between nations. And that instability helped advance his long-term ambitions for the shinobi world. While the people of Kirigakure struggled with the consequences of their harsh traditions, Obito watched from the shadows, quietly ensuring that the system remained intact. Yet no manipulation lasts forever. As the years passed, the strain on the village continued growing. Younger generations of shinobi began questioning traditions that older leaders had once accepted without hesitation. Some instructors in the academy quietly wondered whether forcing children to kill each other truly created stronger ninja, or simply created deeper wounds. These questions did not immediately lead to reform, but they did begin to change how people viewed the future of the village. Kirigakure had long defined itself through strength and survival. Those values were unlikely to disappear completely. But more and more individuals began believing that strength did not necessarily require cruelty. The hidden mist could remain powerful without continuing the Bloody Mist traditions. Of course, such change would not happen easily. the system had been in place for years, and many leaders within the village had built their authority around it. Admitting that the bloody mist ideology had failed would mean acknowledging that countless lives had been sacrificed unnecessarily. And that was a truth many people were not ready to face. Still, the seeds of transformation had already been planted. The rebellion of Zabuza had revealed that resistance was possible. The growing number of missing Naesua had demonstrated that the system was driving people away. And the quiet doubts spreading among younger shinobi hinted that the next generation might not accept the bloody mist traditions forever. All of these forces were slowly pushing Kirigakure toward a turning point, a moment when the village would finally have to confront the truth behind its darkest era. Because eventually, the hidden control over the Mizukage would end. And when that moment arrived, the people of the Hidden Mist would finally see the full extent of the manipulation that had shaped their history. For many years, the people of Kirigakure had lived under the shadow of the Bloody Mist era, without fully understanding how it had truly begun. To most citizens and shinobi, the brutality of their village seemed like the natural result of harsh traditions and uncompromising leadership. The academy's deadly rituals, the constant pressure to eliminate weakness, and the climate of fear surrounding the government all appeared to be part of the identity of the Hidden Mist. But as time passed, the foundations of that belief slowly began to crack. The rule of Yagura Karatachi had lasted long enough that an entire generation had grown up knowing no other leadership. Many young shinobi entering the ranks had never experienced a different kind of Kirigakure. To them, the Bloody Mist system was simply the way things had always been. Yet older shinobi remembered differently. Veterans who had served the village before the height of the Bloody Mist era could still recall a time when Kirigakure, though strict and disciplined, had not demanded the same extreme brutality from its children. The academy had once been harsh, but not murderous. Rivalries existed between students, but those rivalries had been meant to push them toward improvement rather than toward death. The transformation of the academy into a place where students were forced to kill one another had changed the culture of the village completely. And over time, more and more people began quietly wondering how that transformation had truly occurred. Some suspected that the leadership had simply taken the philosophy of strength too far. Others believed that the harsh environment of the Land of Water, with its history of isolation and internal conflict, had slowly pushed the village toward extremism. But the deeper truth remained hidden from nearly everyone. Behind the decisions shaping Kirigakure's darkest era stood Obito Uchiha, the man secretly controlling the Mizukage through powerful genjutsu. By placing Yagura Karatachi under his influence, Obito had effectively turned the leader of the Hidden Mist into a puppet. Policies that maintained the Bloody Mist traditions were quietly reinforced. Opportunities for reform were subtly suppressed, and the atmosphere of fear within the village continued spreading year after year. To the people of Kirigakure, it appeared as though their own leader had chosen this path willingly. In reality, their suffering had been shaped by a manipulator who viewed their village as nothing more than a strategic tool. Obito's larger ambitions required instability across the shinobi world. A peaceful world would be difficult to manipulate, but a fractured one, where villages distrusted one another and internal conflict weakened governments, could be guided toward the outcome he desired. Kirigakure's isolation made it an ideal target for this manipulation. The islands of the Land of Water were separated from the mainland by wide stretches of ocean, limiting contact with other nations. Diplomatic relations with neighboring villages existed, but they were often distant and cautious. This isolation allowed the bloody mist system to persist for years without significant outside interference. But even the most carefully maintained deception eventually begins to unravel. Gradually, certain individuals within the shinobi world started noticing irregularities surrounding the hidden mist. Reports from spies and intelligence networks suggested that the behavior of the Mizukage sometimes seemed strangely rigid. Policies remained unchanged, even when circumstances clearly demanded adaptation. For someone as powerful as Yagura, this level of inflexibility was unusual. Within Kirigakure itself, similar observations began to emerge among experienced shinobi. Some noticed that the Mizukage rarely appeared in public compared to previous leaders. Others quietly questioned why the government seemed so unwilling to reconsider the academy's brutal traditions, even as the number of missing nin leaving the village continued rising. These concerns did not immediately reveal the truth, but they began creating a sense that something about the leadership was wrong. Meanwhile, the long-term consequences of the bloody mist system continued reshaping the village's population. Entire generations had grown up under conditions that encouraged distrust and emotional detachment. Shinobi trained in this environment often became incredibly skilled fighters, yet many struggled to form lasting bonds with their comrades. This lack of trust created subtle weaknesses within the village's military structure. Successful missions in the shinobi world rely heavily on teamwork. Squads must coordinate their abilities, protect one another in battle, and trust their teammates to make the right decisions under pressure. When those bonds are weak, even highly skilled warriors can struggle to function effectively as a unit. Kirigakure's system had produced many powerful individuals, but it had also damaged the cooperative spirit that shinobi teams depend upon. Some instructors within the academy began recognizing this problem firsthand. They watched students graduate with impressive combat abilities, yet display hesitation when working closely with others. The deadly graduation ritual had taught them to view their classmates as enemies first and allies second. Breaking that mindset later in their careers was extremely difficult. At the same time, the reputation of the hidden mist continued spreading across the shinobi world. Other villages spoke of Kirigakure with a mixture of fear and caution. Stories about the Bloody Mist Academy circulated widely, reinforcing the image of the hidden mist as the most brutal of all the great villages. For a time, that reputation served as a powerful deterrent. Few enemies were eager to provoke a village known for producing such ruthless warriors. But reputation alone could not solve the growing internal problems. By this point, the fractures within Kirigakure were impossible to ignore completely. The loss of shinobi through desertion had weakened certain units. The legendary 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist had already begun fragmenting over the years. And the lingering memory of Zabuza Momochi's rebellion continued, reminding people that dissatisfaction existed within the village itself. The Bloody Mist era had once seemed unstoppable. Now, it was beginning to look unsustainable. What the people of Kirigakure did not yet realize was that the end of this dark chapter was slowly approaching. The hidden control over their Mizukage could not last forever. At some point, the influence of Obito Uchiha would weaken or break. And when that happened, the truth behind years of suffering would finally begin to surface. The hidden mist had endured one of the darkest periods in shinobi history. But the moment when that darkness would finally begin to lift was drawing closer. Slowly, quietly, like the first faint light appearing through the morning fog above the silent waters of the land of water. In the long and often turbulent history of Kirigakure, few eras left scars as deep as the period that came to be known across the shinobi world as the Bloody Mist. For years, the village hidden within the thick fog of the land of water had lived under a system that demanded brutality from its people and placed strength above every other value. Children were raised in an academy where survival sometimes meant killing the very classmates they had trained beside for years. Shinobi grew into adulthood, carrying emotional wounds that were rarely spoken about, yet always present beneath the surface. Trust between teammates was fragile, and loyalty to the village often came not from pride, but from fear. From the outside, the hidden mist looked powerful, but internally, it was slowly bleeding. For a long time, the people of Kirigakure believed that this darkness had been created entirely by their own leadership. The rule of Yagura Karatachi had become synonymous with the Bloody Mist era. As Mizukage and the Jinchuriki of the Three Tails, Yagura possessed both political authority and overwhelming combat power. Few shinobi could have imagined challenging him directly, and because of that, the system he presided over appeared immovable. Yet the truth behind the era was far more complicated. Hidden beyond the awareness of most of the village was Obito Uchiha, the man who had secretly manipulated Kirigakure from the shadows. Through powerful genjutsu, Obito had placed Yagura under his control, guiding the Mizukage's actions without the village ever realizing what had happened. To the people of the Hidden Mist, their leader appeared to be enforcing these brutal traditions willingly. In reality, many of the decisions shaping the Bloody Mist era had been influenced by someone who did not belong to their village at all. This manipulation served a much larger goal. Obito believed that the shinobi world itself was fundamentally broken. War, suffering, and endless cycles of revenge had convinced him that reality itself needed to be replaced with something else. His long-term plan required chaos across the world, and weakening individual villages made that chaos easier to create. Kirigakure had become one of the earliest victims of that strategy. But even the most carefully controlled manipulation cannot last forever. Over time, the cracks within the Bloody Mist system continued spreading. The rebellion, led by Zabuza Momochi, had already demonstrated that dissatisfaction existed among the village's own shinobi. Even though the coup had failed, it proved that not everyone accepted the direction Kirigakure had taken. More importantly, it proved that the authority of the Mizukage could be challenged. As the years passed, additional signs of instability appeared. The number of missing 9 leaving the Hidden Mist gradually increased. Some were criminals fleeing justice, but others were talented shinobi who simply refused to continue serving under the Bloody Mist system. Each departure weakened the village slightly, and slowly, those losses began to accumulate. Even the legendary 7 ninja swordsmen of the Mist, once considered one of the most powerful military units in the shinobi world, began to fragment. Some swordsmen died in battle. Others abandoned the village entirely. The unity that had once defined the group gradually faded. These changes were subtle at first, but over time, they became impossible to ignore. Within Kirigakure itself, a new generation of shinobi was beginning to question the traditions they had inherited. Many younger ninja had grown up hearing stories about the academy's deadly graduation ritual and the countless lives lost during the Bloody Mist era. Some accepted those stories as proof of the village's strength. Others began wondering whether such brutality had truly been necessary. Instructors within the academy occasionally asked themselves the same question. They watched their students train, develop friendships, and grow stronger together, only to face the possibility that those bonds might be shattered by the system's deadly expectations. Gradually, the belief that the Bloody Mist ideology was the only path to strength began losing its hold. And as this shift in mindset spread, the village itself moved closer to a moment of transformation. The eventual end of the Bloody Mist era did not happen through a single dramatic battle. Instead, it unfolded gradually as the hidden forces controlling the village began to unravel. When the influence over Yagura Karatachi was finally broken, the truth behind years of brutal policies slowly began to surface. For the people of Kirigakure, that realization was both shocking and painful. Their village had suffered through one of the darkest periods in shinobi history. Children had been forced to kill one another. Families had been torn apart by suspicion and violence. Talented shinobi had abandoned their homeland, unable to endure the system any longer. And much of that suffering had been shaped by manipulation from the outside. Yet even in the aftermath of such darkness, Kirigakure did not collapse. Instead, it began to change. A new generation of leaders eventually emerged. Leaders who believed that the hidden mist could still be strong without embracing the brutality that had defined the Bloody Mist era. These leaders understood that true strength did not come solely from fear or violence. It also came from unity, trust, and the willingness to learn from the mistakes of the past. Among those who would later guide the village toward this new future was Mei Terumi, who would eventually become the 5th Mizukage. Under her leadership, Kirigakure began moving away from the traditions that had once defined it. The academy system was reformed, and the deadly graduation ritual that had terrified generations of students was finally abandoned. The transformation was not immediate. Healing the scars of the Bloody Mist era would take many years. But the direction of the village had changed. The Hidden Mist, once feared as the most brutal of the great shinobi villages, slowly began rebuilding itself into something different. A place where strength still mattered, but where compassion and cooperation were no longer treated as weaknesses. Looking back, the story of the Bloody Mist stands as one of the most tragic chapters in the history of the shinobi world. It is a story of manipulation, a story of fear, and a story of how an entire village was pushed into darkness without fully understanding why. Yet it is also a story about resilience, because even after years of bloodshed and suffering, the people of Kirigakure eventually found a way to rise from the fog that had once consumed them. And in doing so, they proved that even the darkest chapters of history do not have to define the future forever.